Welcome to the Neutral Podcast, where we discuss paving the way to a sustainable tomorrow. I'm Nate Helbach, your host, founder, and CEO of the Neutral Project, a sustainable real estate development company. Join us each week as we host world-renowned guests and explore dynamic landscapes of real estate development, alternative investing, sustainability, forestry, urbanism, and new cutting-edge carbon-neutral construction materials that are shaping the cities of tomorrow. Welcome back to the Neutral Podcast. Today I'm joined by Troy Harris, where we're going to discuss forestry and timberland. Troy is the managing director of Timberland and Innovation Wood Products at Jamestown. Troy has over 30 years of expertise in public and institutional investing, portfolio management, and timberland operations, proven success in public and institutional timberland portfolio management, and a track record of timberland acquisition and disposition, operations management, and business development across the United States and Brazil. Troy has also led disposition of 538,000 acres valued at approximately $880 million, including taking Wells Timberland REIT public at Catchmark Timber Trust. He has been responsible for operations and management of nearly 1 million acres, valued at over $1.3 billion, and the planting of over 30 million seedlings. Troy is a passionate advocate of mass timber industry and has served a key role in connecting the commercial real estate industry to the mass timber industry by working to build the first Georgia-grown mass timber building at Ponce City Market in Atlanta, connecting sustainably managed working forests to the built environment. Troy is a certified forester and serves on the board of the Forest Landowners Association, the Georgia Forestry Association, the Executive Committee of National Alliance of Forest Owners, and is a trustee for Georgia Forestry Foundation. He received a Bachelor's of Science in Forest Management from Auburn University, and he earned a Master's of Business Administration with a concentration in real estate investing from the University of Georgia. Welcome to the show, Troy. Thanks for coming on. Maybe you could start off with just giving us a little background on your academic studies and then a little bit about your career.
Sure. Thanks, Nate. I'm really excited to be here today. So as you said, I graduated from forestry school from Auburn University. And so I think maybe I'm your first forester that you've interviewed as far as the podcast goes. And so I'll try to wear that hat today. I originally grew up in Oregon. And so I've got, a lot of different experiences and was an Eagle Scout. And so just really loved being outside and being in the forest and just kind of knew when I went to school that part of a career was something that really appealed to me, and being outside and being outdoors and being part of the forest. And so I got into forestry, over 30 years ago. And my career has kind of been an interesting path of the way our forests and forest ownership has kind of matured over that time. And 30 years ago, I went to work for a pulp and paper company when the pulp and paper companies basically owned a large majority of the timberland in the United States. And but then, shortly into my career, there was kind of a transition where, much like commercial real estate, there's investors who do want to own real assets for different reasons. And I think we'll talk about that later. But bottom line is you started seeing larger institutional investors investing in forest land when the paper companies were selling that land to investors who basically knew that they were going to grow trees, do it sustainably, continue to supply their mills. And so you saw a real shift into timberland being kind of a real asset class. And I enjoyed that, but that ultimately has led me along the way with different companies and different structures. But now I've been at Jamestown for 9 years. Jamestown actually is a large commercial real estate company with, over $11 billion of assets under management. We're best known, I think, in the industry for a couple of things. We embraced kind of sustainability a long time ago in basically doing adaptive reuse. And we've got many successful projects in adaptive reuse. Probably our most known is Chelsea Market in New York City. But I'm basically officed at Ponce City Market in Atlanta, which has been a huge success here in Atlanta. And so we really like the adaptive reuse lane. If you're going to make a building more sustainable and more environmentally friendly, recycling an old building is a really great way to do that. And so being part of that commercial real estate company, we kind of asked ourselves what was next. I run the timberland division for Jamestown. And so we've got these timberland assets, but we also do commercial. And we started asking ourselves, how are you going to make, a new building look old and feel cool as a Ponce City Market? And the answer to us and the sustainability side, also the answer was mass timber. And so I've spent a lot of my time over the last more than a few years working on mass timber and kind of connecting the dots between mass timber and sustainable forestry.
That's awesome. That leads us right into our first segment in regards to sustainable forestry. And you are our first forester that we're interviewing. So this will be very helpful, as a lot of our guests have been mass timber experts and focused on the supply chain and construction side of things. But going back even farther from manufacturing into how do forests work and what are the most sustainable forest practices, could you just give us kind of a quick teaser into what is sustainable forest practices and how do you guys practice those at Jamestown?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this kind of all comes into that, a healthy forest has healthy timber markets. And so if you're going to be practicing sustainable forestry, the whole concept is that you're never over harvesting more than you grow. And as a forester and a manager of our forests, I know and how our trees grow. That's what I was trained on. And as foresters out in the woods, we know how to do that well. We know how to keep our forests healthy and growing, and then able to provide products that people use and consume every day. And the concept is that I only take what I'm growing. And so you basically manage your harvests in a way that you know what you're growing every year. That's your allowable cut. That's what you're allowed to harvest. Then you reforest that and replant that and start the cycles over. And therefore you're not ever going to run out of wood. And that just makes sense from an institutional, like real estate wise. You want to take good care of your assets and keep them growing and keep them, returning what they do. But planting forward and planting for the next generations is something we think about because our life cycle is a lot longer than that. I think what's important when you think about that concept and sustainability and understanding where your wood is coming from is a huge part of, what we've tried to tell at Jamestown. Make sure people understand that, because if you think about what the United States looks like, at least about 70% of the forests in the United States are privately owned. And those forests are privately owned working forests. People are owning them. They have a reason to own those forests and manage them and take care of them well. Of the 70% of forests in the United States, 90% of the wood products that we use and consume daily, 90% comes from that 70%. So we're more than putting out our fair share of what, the country needs as far as products. And when you think about products, lots of people think about lumber, especially if you're in mass timber, or furniture, flooring, the things that we can see that we readily identify as wood. But, more than half of the products that we consume are like the pulp and paper products. And so the lower end, lower value type products. But we use, 99.7% of the tree is used when we harvest it and cut it down in different products. But don't forget the pulp and paper. Don't forget about the boxes and the Amazon cartons and your diapers. And don't forget, about the thin sheet of cell on your cell phone. So you're literally touching trees every day if you use a phone on the protective covering. And there's so much that we consume every day. And we only harvest about 2% of our forests on an annual basis. And so we provide 90% of the products that we need with only harvesting 2%. And then we're reforesting that and starting the cycle over. So we feel really good about where we are as far as sustainability and the forests in the United States. We've got a great story and we're working to tell that better.
Yeah, that's really great. So 2% of everything we grow in the United States is actually what is harvested to be used in wood products.
Yeah. Wow. So we only harvest 2% of our forests every year on a sustainable basis. And then that is replanted and restarted over. can create 90% of what we use of all the things that we use wood for, as only 2% every year of what we're cutting.
Wow. And so one of the things I am really interested in is this idea that you talked about, that every year for maybe your specific forest, but sounds like a lot of the forests have the same cutting strategy, is that they look at the total amount of wood that's grown in that forest in that year, and then that's your allowable cut. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So then once you establish your allowable cut, you're basically then not really, I mean, in theory, cutting any wood in your forest. They're just reallocated between older trees that have gotten taller and now these little seedlings that are going to be starting to grow.
That's right. And I think as we get into bubble down in our conversation today, hopefully we'll kind of talk about, this concept is lots of people tend to think of our forests in this context that we're talking about right now as a mature forest gets harvested, and then there aren't any trees again. Or some people think, okay, well, you're like buying a field and planting trees, and now you got to wait 30 years for those to be harvested. Our forests that we manage, and especially as an industry, they're a gigantic mosaic of forests, different types of forests, different ages of forest, different things going on, different, critters living in those forests. And so you have to think about this, this 70%, of working forests, it's 614 million acres. That's like the size of 3 Texases is what we're talking about in our country that are providing forests, but they're all providing different things at different times. And that's the beauty of forests and our investment in what we're talking about here is that you can't just focus on the trees that are being harvested today. That's one small picture. And that cycle gets started over again. What we're talking about is this gigantic mosaic of forests, healthy, growing, sequestering a lot of carbon, providing a lot of biodiversity, all these great things that come with the forest to provide us with the wood products that we need today. Mass timber just being a small part of, overall what we use wood for.
And you mentioned one thing, which is clear cutting of trees, where you're kind of clearing a whole forest out. And we see that on a lot of advertisements about how non-sustainable it is and how it kills biodiversity and really corrupts and harms wildlife. What are you doing when you go in and cut trees down? Are you just taking your good old chainsaw and chopping one at a time, or how do you go and cut trees?
So certainly depends on what your objectives are and where you are in the country or in the world as that goes. And, I don't think we don't love the word clear cut in our industry because clear cut defines, like, it almost seems like that's the end of everything, right? And nobody says, I'm going to go clear cut my field of corn. And nobody says, if you've got a garden in your backyard, nobody clear cuts their garden at the end of the season. But if you're a gardener, at the end of the season, you take everything down and then you wait and you replant the next spring, right? And you start over again. And so I think we don't think about clear cutting as a final thing. That's not what we do. We harvest, we have a final harvest, and then we start our cycles over again. And sometimes, like in the U.S. South, we do have forests that are kind of, that we cut and harvest and then replant more like crops. And then that we are cutting, a certain area down. We are enrolled in a program of certification called the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, or SFI, with Jamestown. Many large landowners are registered under that certification process in the United States. The other one that lots of people talk about is FSC, which is a little bit more of a global dynamic as well, but same kind of thoughts and principles about all the things that we do. But I mean, we be under that certification system, and just the way we think, we don't want to cut too big of area at once. We want kind of a mosaic of a quilt-like pattern all over the place. And that pattern creates different, like I said, different age classes, different habitats. Most animals need a variety of habitats, not one single habitat. So, one old forest is not ideal habitat for most creatures. They need all kinds of edge effects and all kinds of other things will come along with it. So, by practicing good forestry and foresters doing what they're doing and maximizing biological tree growth, taking good care and making sure that we don't have insects and disease and fire, all those things, lead to actually a better ecosystem. And I'll be a little bit provocative and say, that Mother Nature loves a clear cut, And what people don't really understand about forests is that they are a biological thing. And when they get too old, just like people, they start getting old and unhealthy and diseased and sick, and they're not able to fight, insects and disease. They're not, then they lead them, unhealthy forests that are dying and decaying lead to these catastrophic wildfires that we're seeing in places. And so good forest management, good healthy markets can help us with that. But if you let your trees just grow and grow and grow, Mother Nature will figure out a way to do it. And she loves a clear cut, and she'll do that with, bugs and insects and disease or fire. And that's some of the systems that we have those problems.
Yeah. No, my parents live in Redding, California, which is Northern California, about 3 hours north of San Francisco, for those who don't know. And there is a massive fire there about 5 years ago. Yep. And it literally clear cut the whole, miles upon miles of trees. And it's so sad because it's nice redwoods in Northern California, but it's definitely happening if you don't take care of your forests. And that leads me to my question of how does Jamestown kind of take care of their forests to avoid, the biggest threat, which is wildfires, but then also with insects and disease?
Yeah, I think that goes back to just as good foresters and taking good care of our properties, we can be proactive and manage against that risk. And so, again, having different age classes of trees and different species, and in the South, you might talk about hardwood, natural hardwood bottom areas that help protect those types of things. But one system of all the same trees with all the same properties, lends itself to problems. And so, if we can go in there and, we may go in there and do thinnings, which is taking some trees out to allow the other trees to grow bigger, stronger, better, faster. That's a practice that we use in the Southeast. And it's also, we have a northern forest as well. Half of our assets are up in the Northeast. And so that's more of a natural ecosystem where we selectively harvest just a few trees at a time every 5 or 10 years. We go in and take a few trees out, and that keeps that forest, all of our forests healthy and growing. And when you have that, you have not only a healthy forest with lots of ecosystems for different, things like biodiversity, but you're also taking really good care of things like watershed, and water becomes a big resource and opportunity with forests because lots of rain falls on our forest and it filters it out where it gets down to your drinking water. It absorbs a lot of, flood waters. When things do flood, they flood in the forest, but then they recede. So we offer a lot of great benefits that way as well. But all these things are a big part of, a forester's tool bag to basically manage a forest well, but also creating all these other great things that come along with it.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we maybe don't talk about enough as the mass timber industry, is we're focused kind of monomaniacally on this idea of carbon sequestration in the forest, with kind of disregarding the ideas of like biodiversity and healthy water and healthy air. And so how are forests helping with those kind of other benefits in our ecosystem?
Yeah, well, I think the fun thing about what I do, as far as, managing, land at a large scale, and the other people that do what I do in the private, circles, is that, we're all out there trying to, take great care of our forests, just like you would with your real estate buildings, right? You don't want to let them go down. And so you maintain them, you keep them safe. So we're doing all that. But I think the great thing about our asset class in timberland is that we're doing it at scale. And so I think we offer this very interesting, different thing that because, we're owning, hundreds of thousands of acres and we're keeping them healthy and managed, and there's other people doing the same thing, we're really driving huge carbon, sinks, if you will. For example, the small area of timberland, we manage about 100,000 acres. We sequestered 280,000 metric tons of carbon equivalent last year just through biological growth alone. That's like the same amount as 36,000 homes, I think, is that, or that's like taking 66,000 cars off the road just with what I consider kind of a little small investment. When we kind of benchmark that against just our Jamestown commercial real estate portfolio, our our biological growth of carbon that's being sequestered in the forest on an annual basis would, be 3 times the amount of what our building emissions put off. So we're doing a lot of impact and a lot of good by taking care of the forest and doing all of these things. And it's not just the carbon that you're locking away in a building. If you're using wood, it's all out there and you're getting all these other great things. We're, in today's world, we're calling that natural capital and natural capital solutions. And so it's not just about the carbon anymore. It's about all these other things that come along with our forests.
Yeah, interesting. We're going to talk about natural capital towards the end, but I want to stay on this topic for a little bit longer of sustainable forestry. One of the things that I've been geeking out with a buddy is this idea of carbon capture and the ability to sell carbon on the open markets to kind of help promote these more nuanced ideas of mass timber and forestry and proper forestation. And so one of the things that we've been talking about is at the forest level, does the amount of carbon that we sequester in the forest, does that allow us to take that carbon in the forest, and are we able to sell that on the open market, or are you able to sell that on the open market?
Yeah, absolutely. It is definitely possible, and there's a number of companies that are doing that currently. And I think that I hate to call it the Wild West, but it's a little bit of the Wild West right now, because what we're talking about for the most of these are not like California carbon registry protocols in a regulatory environment where it's required is a completely different thing, with rules and very defined things of what they're trying to accomplish. What most people in the forestry carbon world right now are doing are voluntary markets, voluntary credits. And so, I was just talking about, I know and can measure, because as a forester, I care about, my biological tree growth. So I know what my trees are growing biologically. That's how it's actually pretty easy for me to tell you what our carbon storage is on an annual basis on my forests. And I think most foresters could calculate that number on their forests. But the concept is I am taking that much carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it out in the woods. And so from a voluntary market, can you translate that number into something that is worth something to somebody looking to offset that? And basically take care of emissions that are like a bad emission, right? And so you've got lots of companies and corporations that are out there looking for ways to lower their carbon footprint and sincerely do that. And so the concept with forest credits is, is it just that biological growth alone? And it could be, but a lot of people right now are saying, okay, that's just normal business as usual for you. You're not changing anything. You're not doing behavior. So what if I asked you, instead of harvesting that annual growth next year, what if you deferred it? And what if you deferred it for 10 years? And so lots of new protocols and voluntary market credits are saying, okay, asking the forest landowner to say, basically, I'm going to do something different than what I was doing before. And so those are the markets that are out there, and you see those traded and different companies getting into that. You get lots of companies that are basically, I think, starting to think about owning forests for just that carbon capture concept, which is kind of really interesting to me.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And so when these buyers are coming to you or others and saying, hey, we want to buy carbon credits, they're saying, hey, you kind of have your normal business activities that you would be doing regardless of us. We're not going to buy those credits. But if you choose to maybe forego a harvesting year or keep a few trees that you would rather maybe not keep, or extend your forest life cycle from maybe 40 years to 60 years, that's what they're saying, okay, we'll pay you for that differential.
That's in our world, and I think in the carbon world just in general, that's called additionality. And that's what a lot of investors that want to offset for some different reason, the Microsofts, the Googles of the world that are interested in creating a way in a mechanism that will help them lower their other impacts. That's exactly what they're looking for, is that additionality. What are you doing differently to create and change behavior?
Interesting. And so one of the things with that additionality that I've been thinking a lot about is, if they're saying, okay, or let's just say you go to Microsoft and you set aside X number of acres of forest and you say, we're not going to harvest this on a 40-year rotation, but rather on a 60-year rotation, right? I don't know exactly what
That's right.
that would be, but let's just say it's some species that can go to 40, from 40 to 60. If you do that, would the biomass of the carbon stay at a constant? So like every year they're basically offsetting a certain amount of carbon, or does the biomass increase over that time period because the trees are growing bigger and assumingly taking more carbon in?
That is a long story of PhD in different forests. And so that's not something that we could actually answer today. And it depends. It really depends on what the market, the voluntary market wants. But
Yeah,
I think most foresters would argue that if your objective is to sequester the most possible carbon and achieve the largest benefit, then actually harvesting at the top of a cycle when a tree gets to a certain age, it starts slowing down in growth, and therefore starts not sequestering as much carbon. Because if you remember, in photosynthesis, trees are taking in carbon dioxide, CO2, carbon, and 2 elements of oxygen. That carbon is literally the building block of the tree that we're talking about, is getting taken out of the air and put into the tree. And so if it's growing healthy and fast, it's going to be taking in more carbon units. And as it gets older, it does slow down. And so there's a strong argument that says if I harvest my trees when they start getting to the top of their cycle and aren't sequestering as much carbon and start with a young forest again, that I'm definitely going to make more carbon. There's other schools of thought that go into the carbon that is out in the forest, and that, as trees get older and bigger in diameter, there is more carbon out there stored on the forest. And that's kind of what they're going for. I would, as we pivot our conversations here in a bit, that gets into the concept of mass timber. And that gets into the concept of, okay, what, if you harvest a tree, what is it going to be made into? And is it going to be made into lumber or pulp and paper? And pulp and paper has a shorter half-life, is how they measure those things. And so if it's made into pulp and paper, then it's not sequestering as much carbon. But if it gets made into lumber and turns into a home, or if it gets turned into mass timber, which lasts 100 years or whatever we decide ultimately that cycle is, that's permanently stored carbon, blocked off in a carbon vault in a mass timber building. That kind of gets me really interested in, you can kind of have both. If you're putting it in long-lived wood products, you kind of get to double down. And I think that's where innovation comes in, and how people think about carbon and how that builds off of the building blocks on what we're going to do moving forward in this mass timber space.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's really interesting. There's a case study I've been following with, if you've heard of Port Blakely, out in Oregon. They just created basically a carbon forest, and they're extending the growth cycle of the trees from 40 to 60. And so it was an interesting idea. And I've heard these two school of thoughts of one being, well, let's keep the carbon in the live tree for longer so that it basically prolongs the carbon from re-emitting back into the atmosphere. Or let's put it in a wood product like mass timber and try to have the wood product stay as that form of wood for a longer period of time. For example, mass timber, 100, 150 years in a building, maybe longer if we figure out a way to recycle it.
Yeah. So and in your neck of the woods, by the way, there's a new company, they're a new company called Anew, and they're probably the thought leaders in carbon, and they've been in these voluntary markets, and they just became, a very, very large landowner up in the UP, buying a huge piece of timberland that they're going to put in the carbon markets and doing it a different way. So they're right there in your neck of the woods.
What is their name, Troy?
Anew, Anew, Anew.
Anew. Okay, I'll have to look them up. That's cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we could belabor this point for a long time, but I will reluctantly move on.
Okay.
Yeah. And I want to talk a little bit about your Senate testimony. And I understand that a Georgia senator invited you to testify at the U.S. Senate about forestry and carbon. And so maybe you could just give us a little kind of teaser into what that testimony entailed.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Basically, I think that Congress is really interested in sustainability, and so I had the honor of being asked by the Senate Ag Committee to come up and testify in regard to forestry and forest practices, but also how that ties back to mass timber and mass timber construction. At the time in 2021, we'd announced our project in Atlanta here for 619 Ponce, with our vision to do that using our own, Georgia grown timber. And so I had the pleasure of speaking before Congress about not only how sustainable forestry, like we've just been talking about, works, but how that ties back into mass timber. And I think that, that makes a logical sense, and why, I became passionate about this subject, and why I'm so passionate about mass timber, and, hopefully why we did this project at 619 Ponce. But, as I was a forester going to mass timber conferences and talking to people and being kind of the only forester in the room, and you're talking about mass timber to people in the real estate world and developers and architects, the first question back then was, is the building going to burn down? And I think we've got great solutions, and I don't get that question about mass timber buildings much anymore at all. But what I do get and continue to get all the time is, well, if we're going to build with mass timber, are we going to destroy the rainforest? Or are we going to cut old growth timber? And what's the sacrifice if we start using wood for mass timber buildings and start doing all that? As a forester, I know the answer, that sustainably managed forests will provide us more than enough wood to make our mass timber buildings and to change the way we build. And so getting up to testify in front of the Senate and talk about sustainability and forestry and how that all ties back together in the supply chain, and how that benefits, rural economies, and also stimulates, growth for our economy was, a real pleasure.
I get that question a lot, Troy. Do we go and cut down big old growth oak trees and use those for our buildings? And the answer is no. We're using all softwoods, which are, almost a crop, I would say. I don't know if you agree with that, but it's basically a crop that we're foresting. And it's not like the old buildings back in the late 1800s, early 1900s that you see, where it's big old post and beam oak and hardwood trees that we're using. But one of the questions I had for you in regards to the Senate was, why are they so interested in forestry specifically, and mass timber? Like, what benefits do they see with mass timber helping maybe U.S. agriculture and forestry in general?
Yeah. I think the most exciting thing with that question is, what do they see? Is I think they see an issue where you can get bipartisan support in today's world of news cycles and everything. We tend to see a lot of the frictions, and those are the things that make stories. But I will say, it being, up on the Hill quite a bit, that, there actually is work that gets done up there. And it's the stuff in the middle and the bipartisan support. And so, what the joy of, testifying in front of the Senate is that you get, asked to go do that. And the chairwoman, Debbie Stabenow at the time, and then John Bozeman from Arkansas, Democrats and Republicans, both very, very supportive of the mass timber industry. Amy Klobuchar is also extremely excited about mass timber from Minnesota. And then, my senators, Senator Warnock and Senator Ossoff, are both huge supporters of mass timber and mass timber construction. These all really fit in the lane of U.S. Forest Service, which is under USDA. And then the punchline here is that all these supporting things that go into this channel are all under the Farm Bill. And so most of the discussions up there are focused on how much we should put into the Farm Bill to support the timber industry. And, there's definitely a strong willingness and support by both sides of the aisle to support mass timber. The Wood Innovation Grant is a great example of that, helping to, literally seed our industry with mass timber and get things going. But I think we've all benefited, done mass timber buildings at points in time with help and support from programs that the government is putting into place. And I think that's key and critical. I also think that the one thing that they're working on up there is to, what's important we count, we measure. And so the government, the federal government especially, is a clear place where the government can help us with counting carbon and accounting for carbon and helping us figure out what, a fair metric is. And so we were just talking about these voluntary carbon credits and how you would sell them. If the government would come in and kind of set the rules and foundations on how you how you count carbon, that would be extremely helpful in telling our story and where we're telling our story and what the impact is in different regions. Like, all of those things are incredibly important. And it's not often that you get, a Senator Tommy Tuberville from Alabama stacking hands with a Senator Warnock in Georgia. Those two don't normally mix and match, but in mass timber they do. And they're glad to come to the table together, which is just kind of a fun thing that actually, things are working up there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's nice to set the politics aside and actually get something done.
It definitely is.
I was just at a roundtable with USDA, with the USDA secretary, and one of the things that we were talking about was this idea of how do we get mass timber to be more widely adopted. And so one of the concepts that was discussed, which I found really interesting, was if you've ever heard of the Section 48, which is a geothermal tax credit, which we have used on a few of our projects. The idea was creating a similar tax credit, but for mass timber, so that if you build with mass timber, you get a credit of some percentage of the actual cost of that timber back to compensate for the increase in costs versus steel and concrete. And it sounded like that it might be something that would be moved forward, but we'll see. But I think that would really kind of stir a lot of mass timber development.
Yeah. And Georgia's put our stake in the ground with our Georgia Carbon Registry, which is, basically, giving credits for mass timber buildings. And again, that's innovation that hopefully we help stimulate, some things going on. But it's a little bit frustrating. You're a good example of, some of the government support programs that are moving the dial in little tiny ways. And, I probably most of the listeners on this podcast understand that the built environment is a huge part of where our missions and our problems and our scopes are. And, if that's 40% and then 11% of emissions are coming from how we build, this is the lane to be in, trying to change things, and change things at giant impact. And so mass timber, I think, really does move the dial in a big way. Whereas some of these other stimulus programs, are just these little things that aren't really helping that much. That's where I get excited. And I think they're starting. I think they do see that.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that I heard too on both sides, and it was interesting because it's the Republicans have their talking points when it comes to forestry and mass timber, and the Democrats have their talking points. But one of the things that was kind of coming from both sides was this idea of, which you mentioned before, healthy forests have healthy wood markets. And one of the things in Wisconsin, which it sounds like you would be familiar with, is our pulp industry has been really big. But since the paper industry has been decreasing relatively rapidly over the last 2 decades, now our forest industry in Wisconsin is suffering. And so how do you think mass timber and other innovative wood products would help kind of the wood industry in areas where maybe they were really heavily supported by the pulp industry?
Yeah, and I think that, I think that the way that mass timber conceptually helps this is really the whole key of logic to mass timber. And you kind of alluded to it a little earlier, but I mean, mass timber, we've been doing it for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? It just was big logs that were cut into squares and used for amazing buildings and structures. And mass timber is the same thing, except for we're using smaller and smaller pieces of wood to do that. And so really right now that's come down to, at least in the US, we're using, 2x6s and 2x8s and 2x4s to make our mass timber products. And so we're using dimensional lumber, but there's certainly no reason why we can't continue to evolve and innovate and use smaller and smaller pieces of wood to make our wood and wood products. There's amazing, fascinating things that are more like pulp that would go into mass timber structures. I know Michael Graydon's working on some really cool stuff that he's talking about. But the concept is if we're allowed to take the benefit, and the world is allowed to change its thinking on that wood is good and understands that from sustainable forests, and if we can use our wood products efficiently and really honor what we're cutting and harvesting and then starting the cycle, but honoring it and what we build with, and embrace that. And we understand that that's a great substitute for the way that we're doing things traditionally. Like, there's no telling what innovation comes next. And I think that we'll continue to evolve and innovate and create better uses for lower value products on our woods and just do a better and better job with it. And I think that's clear and obvious that will happen. We just need to continue doing what we're doing.
Interesting. Yeah, I found it really interesting how like a lot of it sounded like the lumber that we're using for pulp could be used for mass timber. Obviously, there's different grading for that lumber, but it sounds like a lot of it that is going towards the pulp industry that maybe has been reduced could be kind of diverted into the mass timber or equivalent industry, like other mass timber products, not necessarily CLT, but maybe mass plywood or things of that nature.
Yeah, and it's mass timber, but it's also, like I said earlier, alluded to, like the strength in your cell phone covering is cell technology from trees on most phones, and so there's no reason why, as you continue to innovate and you're substituting trees for plastics and petroleum based products, and all of these things are being adapted, and there's amazing things coming out. I have all the faith in the world that we can use trees different ways to create different products that we need, and there's no telling what's next.
Yeah. Okay, moving into the next segment here, which is Ponce City Market.
Yeah.
Which is a real impressive projects you guys did down in Atlanta. I know the U.S. Senate invited you back to talk about this idea, which is seedling to solutions, which I always think about for some reason, like a farm-to-table restaurant and a great tomato that the chef went out and picked that afternoon, and then I eat it that evening on my plate. And I think that's exactly what you guys did, but it was maybe a little bit more complicated than going in your backyard and picking a tomato. So could you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. No, and I mean, again, this kind of comes from being at a mass timber conference and being challenged on, listening to somebody say how we should build mass timber buildings, and me being a little bit frustrated with like my world. I understand supply chain and where our trees are coming from and the process they go through, and I think when we built 619 Ponce and we put it out for bid, we just like a lot of developers, we put it out there, pricing came back, and we were a little bit surprised to find out that, our cheapest source of mass timber was going to be from Austria. And I love our Austrian friends. I'm not trying to say anything different, and they do a great job with their forestry as well, and their supply chain and stuff. But it really doesn't make a lot of sense to ship a wood building all the way from Europe to the state of Georgia, when Georgia is the number one forestry state in the nation. And so when that happens, I manage forests for Jamestown, just south of Atlanta, that we, are under the SFI certification program, and we know all about sustainability. We just really all said together at one moment, let's take a pause here. We can do this. We can make this cost effective, and we can do it locally sourced and create a farm to table building in Atlanta, Georgia. And if not in Atlanta, where? Because of the industry and the industry support. And so, what we did basically was we have our own forests, and we sell product to the market when we sell timber. So we started with our good friends at Georgia Pacific. Georgia Pacific just so happens to have its headquarters here in Atlanta, Georgia, and their building kind of overlooks our site here at Ponce City Market. And so we went to our friends and say, hey, look, we want to do a single source mass timber building to prove out that you know where your wood's coming from, you know where it's coming from exactly, and using certified wood is the way to do this. So let's do this together. And so Georgia Pacific, they scratch their heads because mills don't work this way. Mills don't. When wood comes into a mill, it's harvested, and it comes into a log truck, and the logs are taken off, and those logs are put into a pile. And while we know that that wood in that gigantic pile comes from sustainably managed forests all over the place, once it gets into that pile, it gets mixed up. And then once it gets into the pile and then it goes into the mill at different picks and times, that those logs are all getting mixed up. So the supply chain of knowing exactly where your wood came from is kind of almost impossible. And so what our friends at Georgia Pacific did for us is that they create a separate pile of Jamestown logs. And that was the hardest part and the hardest challenge. But we were harvesting. We were using a logging crew that we work with all the time, Evergreen Timber. And every time Evergreen brought our logs into the mill, they set us aside a special pile until we had enough to make the run for the entire building. And so ultimately then they kind of put all our logs in at once and then tracked them through the system. And as they came out the back end of the sawmill, they knew that those were our logs. And that basically creates this farm to table single source, where did your wood come through from part of the solution. Now, along the way, we got great friends from the Georgia Forestry Foundation and through grants through U.S. Forest Service and some other partnerships like Woodworks and SFI. We got some support and we documented this thing and videoed it, the whole chain of how this happened. And so you can go to seedlingstosolutions.org and there are some great videos about how we did this and how we single sourced our building and the different parts of the supply chain. But then we're also blessed with having a mass timber plant in the United States not too far away from that Georgia Pacific sawmill. And so we went from our woods to the sawmill across the border to Alabama because there aren't any mass timber plants in Georgia yet. So we did do that. And then that at Smart Lam in Dothan, Alabama, they made all our mass timber, our glue lam and our CLT. And then some of that was fabricated up in Tennessee by solder, but basically you've got this really tight supply chain that made our building, so like we're talking about over, like a 400-mile procurement zone of where we grew the trees, milled the trees, turned them into mass timber, and then made this beautiful building at 619 Ponce.
That's awesome. That's a wonderful story. And we're going to have that website, seedlingstosolutions.org, in the show notes. So if you're interested in watching those videos, just click there. But one of the questions I had for you, Troy, is you guys don't have your own mill. Is that right?
We do not.
So you use Georgia Pacific for the mill. And so do you think this would have been easier if you guys had your own mill because you would have been processing all your own wood? And then in theory, you would just take kind of that day or that week, whatever you needed for the building and sent it over to Smart Lam for them to make the panels? Or was that not a big complication for you?
Well, in the U.S., I'm not aware of too many people. There may be one that I can think of, but there's not too many people that own timberland, a mill, and a mass timber plant. I think my understanding, Binderholz has that kind of concept like over in Austria, but there's not a lot of that in the U.S. And so the market is fragmented and the mills are very efficient and run very well, but they're not really focused on making mass timber grade product. And so right now, there's just not that demand or market driver signal. There are some mills, I know specifically for like Smart Lam in Alabama, they work with some local mills that are associated with the mass timber plant, Smart Lam, and some of those do custom order. But I think lots of your listeners know that mass timber takes a different kind of spec. It takes longer drying to make that lumber. And so our project was definitely a little harder to do working with a company that doesn't really necessarily focus on that all the time. I think that'll evolve. I think as mass timber continues to develop in the U.S., they'll become a mass timber spec, more like what Europe does, that the mills will custom focus and on making wood and lumber for specifically mass timber. So it would have made it easier for sure, but I don't know many. I know enough, but there aren't a lot of timberland owners with mill assets that could do that. And then also having a mass timber plant, there's just not that many that could pull that off. And that's why it's interesting. Now, all that said, our story tells what's possible and tells it in a very, very tight way. But our next building, let's just say Jamestown wants to build our next building in Charleston, South Carolina. I think we could tell the same locally grown story by sourcing lumber from South Carolina. And maybe we have to ship it to Dothan, Alabama for production or over to Arkansas to Mercer's plant. But the reality is if it was important to a developer, and I think it should be, and an architect wanting to have, if you're talking about carbon being sequestered in a building, like at least get lumber from your own state. And I know Walmart's doing that right now with their project that they're doing. They were very interested in making sure that their lumber for their campus in Arkansas was Arkansas grown, and so they're making sure that was procured in Arkansas. They're shipping it to either Mercer, who's doing some of the wood in their Arkansas plant, but they're also shipping it up to the Northwest, and then they're also SmartLam's doing some work for them, so they're making the CLT in Alabama, but they're also making it in Montana. And so if you went up to Montana right now, you might see Southern Yellow Vine being pressed by SmartLam for the project in Arkansas. I think that makes sense for right now from a localized story. It still lowers the carbon footprint and all the transportation. But I can envision as this industry grows and mass timber plants grow that it would become more and more common to have locally grown, locally sourced buildings. I just think we're like one of the few that have done that right now.
Yeah. No, I mean, being in the industry, I think it's really honorable you guys are doing that. One of the big hurdles that we've seen is from the economic side. We always go out to bid for North American manufacturers, and then we go to Europe and we get the price tag for Europe, and we're like, well, it's like 3 or 4 or even 5% less on a 10 to $30 million scope. And so to be transparent, we've always gone to Europe, and for that very reason of like, it's just economically, it's already more expensive to build with timber, and now it's even more expensive to go North American, and I can't imagine how much more it would be to go local. And so how did you guys overcome that factor on Ponce City Market?
But part of it is we had great partners, and I think part of, and when we did it, we were at the height of craziness with lumber. And so, we did have great partners there, but I think as we pencil it out and the savings and the logistics and all the other things, I think the partners, what you're maybe seeing in the U.S. producers is they don't have all the experience of doing it in the long-term, way that I think Europeans think about it and all the experience they have in doing it. But I think the U.S. markets will become more and more efficient in the way that they procure and the way that they produce. And I think you'll see that, if I'm looking at just the lumber supplies, putting back on my forestry hat, and you think about where lumber is going to be made cheapest in the world, the U.S. South is a clear leader in being able, our fast growth rates, all the mills and all the lumber investments that we have here, we've got a lower priced resource, logistics are strong, and the mill infrastructure is very strong here. We just need more market signals that we want more mass timber buildings, and I think that's strongly being shown as well. So the more and more people that want mass timber buildings, you're just going to keep getting more and more efficient in U.S. markets, and I think we're going to be a clear winner at that point. You do see announcements from some of our friends over in Austria that are looking to locate plants here in the United States. It just makes too much sense, and I think they honestly get the locally grown story is the right way to go to.
Yeah. I mean, I've been to Europe now a few times to visit our partners over there that we're buying timber from, Bindeholz and KLH being two of them, Sorta and so being the other one. But they have a great story to tell because both of them, either themselves or their basically mother companies own forests similar to Jamestown, but then they own also almost the full supply chain from milling into manufacturing and distribution. And one of the things that they've done is they've created this thing called a blank, a CLT blank, which is sold to a lot of the carpenters in the Europe market. And basically it's just a almost dimensional lumber piece of CLT that you can really do whatever you want with. Which I think that's what we need to start doing in the US for us really to get mass adoption and to drive costs down to actually compete with them. Because right now it does feel like even the amount of money that like Mercer and SmartLam have put into mass timber manufacturing, the back end supply chain with the mill and forest isn't quite there yet for us to fully be competitive.
Yeah. And then I think then you get into also the penciling out of what you're underwriting your building for. And those are also the magic in the numbers. But, what is the value of your building to your tenant with a local story versus not? And I think that's the one thing that I think Jamestown and we've done, hopefully very, very well. And I feel like the mass timber industry is getting better and better. And hopefully we can lead as an example. That's why Seedlings Solutions is out there, is if we can tell our story about the sustainability and what we've done and what we're doing and why we built the building and why we built it locally, then I think you're going to see tenants respond to that and be kind of like, okay, maybe that deserves a rent premium. And I think that's, maybe that's a good segue into, the carbon credits that the building got itself with the Georgia Carbon Registry. But as we looked at the building and traditional methodologies, we're roughly 75% carbon reduction doing it the traditional way. And that generates, a carbon number of carbon tons, that are sequestered in the building. That number gets put on the Georgia Carbon Registry and registered with the state, which is important because that means that it's out there. Most importantly, it can be retired. And so if somebody wanted to buy that credit or use that credit to offset their emissions, it would be in an accounting basis, if you will, that everybody could see that it was registered or retired and never used again. My point here is that, as owners of that carbon in that building, Jamestown, in theory, we could go out and sell that carbon to a voluntary market, and maybe a Google or a Microsoft wants to buy that to offset their emissions over here, but they like the innovation and they want to reward innovation. And so maybe that credit, if you will, becomes worth whatever extra you paid for the building, whether that was local sourcing and or you just substituting and changing your behavior and doing something different, like we talked about additionality in the forest. Mass timber rewarding for people changing behavior. I think there's corporations that would think that's an interesting carbon credit just to acquire. We also think that, you could absolutely use that building, just that credit to offset the building's emissions for a certain amount of time every year and make that a net zero building for as long as those credits. So that becomes interesting and becomes a way of reducing, if a company, a building wanted to, like Jamestown, to achieve net zero goals, and that was important, then that's a way to do it just within the building itself. And then thirdly, I think what could be interesting is I can envision it as a tenant amenity, like a gym or a bike rack. If Pottery Barn moved in, which is our ground floor tenant at 619 Ponce, if Pottery Barn wanted to use the carbon offsets generated by the building to offset their own goals, right? They could justify maybe paying a higher lease rate for the building if they got a certain amount of carbon credits from the building they were using, occupying. And then you can actually literally say in your ESG manuals, that business unit or that shop is net zero from a Pottery Barn standpoint. We didn't buy credits, we specifically located in a mass timber building. And so is that lease rate worth more if you've got all those things connecting the dots? I argue it's a more compelling story if you can say it was locally grown versus, it came from Austria.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree with you. I think it's way more compelling. Are you seeing that? Because I know with Ponce City, you guys have started to lease up, and I think Pottery Barn is your anchor tenant. Are you seeing that with lease rates there? If you can't disclose, that's okay too.
I think what I can say is so from a lease perspective, I don't know if you've ever been to Ponce City Market, but our beautiful adaptive reuse here, with a 1928 Sears and Roebuck building. It's huge. We get foot traffic and visitors, we get over 3 million people here a year. An amazing food hall and amazing retail shopping and stuff like that. It already was a hub for rent premiums just because it's not commodity office. And I think what we see in our business is commodity office is really hard. That's not a space most people want to be in right now. But if you've got a differentiated product, like we have, we're 4 stories. You got Pottery Barn on the ground floor. People are just loving the experience of walking into a mass timber building. Everybody I walk in there, and when I talk to the people that work there, they're like, everybody comes in and says it smells so good. What candle are you burning in here? Right. So the experience is amazing and they're thrilled. But then we've got Sage, an HR accounting software company moving their international headquarters over here in the first quarter of next year. They're about ready to start build out, but able to lease office space in this environment and help hold, the kind of type lease rates that we see at Ponce City Market just in general. All those lead us to be thinking that, adaptive reuse and mass timber and non-commodity product is really kind of a very, very interesting way to go. And if the ESG story definitely, we know those tenants were very focused on locating, and that made at the end of the day, we believe that was what won the space.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, especially today, like we might not see, which it sounds like anecdotally, this is what you're saying, a huge increase in rental rate just because people are starting to take a step back from office in general, kind of on a macro level. But on a micro level with Ponce City Market, it sounds like you are seeing occupancy stay relatively high and lease rates stay at what they were originally projected, which in today's market is really a huge success because everyone else is taking massive haircuts and having huge occupancy dips.
And think about it. I mean, you've given tours, right? You tour mass timber buildings and people walk into them. And what I find especially interesting is, my daughter's 25, and when I bring her friends into the building, and of that age group in particular that are the young people starting their careers and stuff, like undoubtedly everybody that I bring into the building of those dynamics, they get it, but they're like, this is the kind of company that I would want to work for. This would be a reason why I would come back to the office and don't want to work at home. And I think these things are really, really important as we think about the overall work environment just changing in general. Is like you're going to have a reason to be back in the office and back together again. And I think, the biophilic design and the way that, a mass timber building feels and smells and all those things, like that's just something that's going to drive people to want to either go work for that company or come back or however, all those things. It's like, it is a, there may be a secret sauce there.
Yeah. Well, in our last 10 minutes, because I know we're running short on time, I want to just discuss briefly these ideas of natural capital solutions that we talked about early on in the episode. But how do you think about this shift kind of towards natural capital solutions in timberland investments?
Yeah. And so again, natural capital and natural capital solutions are definitely coming to the forefront as we think about timber investing in real estate, as an asset class. And, traditionally, forests were invested in for they're kind of almost a safe harbor as an investment in an asset class. Whereas you've got, real estate, traditional real estate is driven usually by like income needs. And so people invest in real estate, traditional commercial real estate, because people pay rent and that drives income and you're looking for kind of an income type return. Forests and timber are different. And one of the reasons, again, why it's kind of different on the Jamestown side, why we have both is, timber is basically more of a growth strategy. It's not necessarily an income strategy. We do generate income from harvesting timber, but really the economics of our return drivers are biological tree growth, and that, trees are growing and they don't care what's going on in the environment. They don't care about a presidential election or a stock market. What they do care about is absorbing carbon and sunlight. And so that part of it leads it to be traditionally a very stable asset class. And so what becomes interesting is that traditionality that institutional investors have been investing in for a long time was becoming more and more interesting. And I think this applies directly to our storytelling with the mass timber audience, is all the other things that come with it. And I think we get buried and lost in our storytelling, perhaps about the carbon and the amount of carbon stored in a building. But it is not just the carbon, it is all the other natural capital that comes along with owning forests. And so, yes, photosynthesis occurs and we capture carbon and we think that's an amazing thing. And that's our bread and butter. But as I alluded to at different points in time during this conversation, the other things that come with it are clean water. So you got clean air, clean water, you got biodiversity, you got rural jobs and a number of other things. But as we own this mosaic of forests, or we're going to use this product in our mass timber buildings, you've got to talk about and understand how much good forests do just in general by being there and being part of what we're doing. And so as I said before, like on a clean water basis, we're filtering a lot of water before it ever gets to your drinking tap. And, that adds value because we practice sustainable forestry and do that under certain certification schemes and stuff. What people don't understand is we take great pride in buffering around streams and making sure our water quality stays high, and that we're not doing silly things that would pollute the water, and that we're that buffer when things flood. That's all benefits that we currently don't get any return on. Biodiversity is probably bigger. If you go to Europe, they've moved past carbon, they've moved past water, which is kind of where the U.S. people are, because you can get paid for water and carbon. Europeans now are very, very interested in biodiversity and habitat loss. And so everybody's looking for explanations on how do we make sure species don't go extinct, and how do we have, all this biodiversity. And our forests, like I said earlier, are a huge part of this mosaic of protecting and enhancing biodiversity in the way that we take care of our forests. We just don't tell that story very good, but we've got all kinds of, critters out there that are thriving because of the way that we manage our forests. And so we can take, one of the interesting things that we've done recently through a group, the National Alliance of Forest Owners, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we've entered under a wildlife memorandum of understanding, program called Conservation Without Conflict. And so most of the large landowners like Jamestown and the other big landowners of the world have agreed that protecting wildlife and working with fish and wildlife at scale is important. And so we've agreed to work together, cooperate, and learn and grow about and protect things like one of the ones that we're working on right now are the bats. Long-eared bat has a problem, but bats in general have a problem. Fish and Wildlife comes in and says, hey, if you guys would not harvest, this type of tree during this time of year, it would really benefit, the bats a lot. And our foresters are going, well, we could do that. That's not a problem. We just didn't know. And so it's just those types of things. And we can do that at scale. These are clear wins for the environment and for everybody. And we really love that partnership.
Yeah, it's really interesting about bats that they want certain trees in certain types of year. But I do think that's a really interesting point, which is something that we probably need to touch on more often as an industry, which is forests have all these ancillary benefits, and it's not just carbon, it's clean air, it's clean water, it's biodiversity. And I think one of the biggest ones, which no one really talks about, which I think probably should be talked about more, is rural jobs. And I think really that's a big one that people overlook because they don't maybe think about who's actually going into the forest and harvesting these trees or who's working in the mills. But it's not your city slicker like you and me who are sitting in our offices and going out into the forest, even though that's probably what I'd love to do. It's everyone in the rural cities that are working in these forests and working in the mills. And so, yeah, that's definitely a story we need to tell a little bit more often.
Well, and I mean, that's the U.S. Senate, that's the stories they want to hear. But most listeners will understand this concept. I mean, with 619 Ponce, we had, 8 people putting up the building, and we had this really interesting ecosystem where we're doing an 18-story traditional right next to us, sharing the same crane. And they had 120 people on that building over next to us. Now, most of us would know that from the mass timber building, like those jobs, a lot of those jobs are moved off-site in a controlled environment. They're in more of a warehouse type environment, a mill environment. The safety is much better. The conditions are much better. Those people in those are getting, great paying jobs in rural economies. So you're basically moving the workforce someplace else. The thing I've never built 100, used 120 people to build a traditional, but those teams, they move. So they may be on your project for a year or two, but they don't know where their next job's going to be. Will it be in Atlanta, or will they have to relocate in Birmingham? Or do they travel from Birmingham to Atlanta and stay here all week and then go home and see their families on the weekends? And so there's lots of workforce safety and just satisfaction that mass timber has really interesting applications on that people don't necessarily grasp. We were lucky enough to have both, see both flavors at once and learn a lot. It's a great experiment.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely throughout the whole supply chain, all the way from forest to the frame. It's really, you're able to have people live in a more stable environment, because I mean, a lot of our construction workers that work on our sites in Madison, Milwaukee, they commute 1 to 2 to even 3 hours away just to work. And it's like, that's 2 to 3 hours every morning, and then 2 to 3 hours every afternoon or evening that they don't get to spend with their family. So I definitely think something we need to talk a little bit more about. Okay, one of the other questions I had is, you talk a little bit about adding value to the forest from a economics perspective. And I totally understand how we can add value to real estate. And when we go into a real estate deal, that maybe we're going to go fix the doors, install new windows, replace the appliances, do things like that. But with forests, how do you add value to a forest? I mean, in my mind, a tree is a tree. And I don't know if you can give it steroids or something to make it grow better, but what is the value add proposition?
Well, certainly just like your steroids, so making sure that the trees are healthy and growing as fast as they can. That's what foresters do, right? So that's just in our nature. That's what we're trying to accomplish as well. I think what's kind of interesting for us are these new things we've talked about with natural capital. And, traditional land ownership is kind of driven by, the incomes off of the timber sales. But, on the bigger picture side, there's things like we talked about earlier, and potentially selling carbon in the future or today is absolutely possible. Water and protecting water rights, and so buffering streams and promising to do that. And so that takes the form of what I would call a conservation easement. And so there's layers that you can put over the top of land ownership and forest ownership that would say, okay, this is going to stay forests and stay working forests, and that's it's not going to be developed into a subdivision. And that's, most of our land loss doesn't come from, people converting into agriculture. It comes from people converting into subdivisions and things like that as we grow and expand. And so identifying important watersheds could be important. Conservation easements can go a number of ways, from just watersheds to biodiversity and habitat loss. And so again, conservation easements, mitigation banks. I talked earlier a little bit about flooding, but there's definitely, as people do develop, the need for mitigation, and whether that's from a construction and development or all kinds of other, applications there. So the forest and driving additional returns or alpha creation, I think, mitigation banks, conservation, water, biodiversity, all of these things are things we think about on a more holistic standpoint, we're adding value to society. And so how do we make sure that value continues to be there? I think those are really fun things to unpack and see where timber and timber investments go. And then on the other side is like mass timber is going to be big for the timberland owners side of the equation. We look really hard to housing starts, and that's a big important number for us that our industry has always is really the mover of that. But mass timber, as it's projected right now, within 10 years is going to increase the demand side by about 6% on lumber. And that's a new mover. That's a new innovative product. And that excites me. And that will send new market signals to landowners to continue to manage their lands well. It may open up different ownerships that don't have as many mills. And like we talked about earlier, innovation and innovative wood products and substituting wood in all different formats and manners, again, sends a market signal to forest owners to take great care of their lands and manage them and continue to manage them. If they don't have any value, there's no value to spend money in managing it, right? And so it's just going to be unhealthy. And that's not what we want. And that doesn't sequester the carbon, that doesn't protect water, that doesn't protect biodiversity. So foresters doing their work out in the woods, taking great care of the land, because there's a reason to do so, I think is the best solution of all. And there's all kinds of exciting things coming along the line. And I'm just excited to see what happens next with innovation, because mass timber is pretty exciting, but there's all kinds of cool stuff out there.
Yeah. Well, Troy, thank you for coming on. This was a really awesome conversation. And I'll link in the show notes to jamestown.com and your profile if people want to learn more or research. I'll also link in the show notes the seedlingssolutions.org so that people can read a little bit more on that. But great. I really appreciate the conversation we had today. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Nate. That was a lot of fun.
At the Neutral Project, we're not just building structures, we're building a legacy of sustainability, helping align your investments with a sustainable future. We'd like to thank you for being part of this conversation. For more information and to stay up to date on how we're reshaping the future through environmentally conscious development, visit our social media accounts or our website at theneutralproject.com. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the Neutral Podcast.